Hello, everyone, and welcome to Matt. Hi. Welcome to the March tea break. And Today we're talking about the effect of having children in the household on cultural engagement. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight here at the Audience Agency. And for the purpose of description, I'm a white male with blonde hair and various sort of postcards and things scattered behind me. And I'm joined by my colleague, Nancy. So if you want to do a quick intro of yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Nancy Sheterline. I'm a senior consultant at the Audience Agency and I mainly lead on projects based in Wales.
What we're going to talk about is the impact of children on cultural engagement. This isn't necessarily just engagement with children, but it's looking at what happens to engagement levels as people have children and as the age of children in their household changes. And the reason for this is, the thing that intrigued me is that we've been collecting data through our cultural participation monitor for a long time, and each time we asked people a whole load of questions about who they are, their demographics, whether they have children, how old those children are, and then loads of things about cultural engagement. But we hadn't actually put those two things together. So I realised that we were sitting on this data set of a representative sample of the whole population with all those things together, and that could be quite interesting. And I particularly think back to a particularly great piece of research. So I saw someone called Orion Brooke do, who's now a board member of ours, but used to work in research at Audiences London, and the precursor of the Audience Agency. And she did a great piece of research where she took the box office data they had in Snapshot London, which is the precursor of Audience Finder or Audience Answers, and looked at, can you predict levels of cultural engagement by the demographics of particular small local areas? So if you know what the area is like, can you guess how much attendance data you have in it? And from that, work out which factors seem to make a difference on engagement. And I've remembered ever since, there was this really nice finding she had that having children was one of the handful of most important factors in terms of cultural engagement, and that if you had children, you were more likely to engage in arts and culture. But if you had a child under 5, you were less likely. So you get this sort of interesting kind of S shape where attendance engagement drops, then it goes up as a result of having children. And I've kind of held that ever since as, okay, so here's one of the nice standard, rule of thumb, useful measure to have in mind for cultural engagement. And I thought, well, maybe we ought to check it based on our survey data to see whether we're seeing the same thing. Spoiler, not entirely. But we do broadly. And I should say this partly because I'm in no means contradicting Orion. We do see it in a way that would match with the data that she was looking at. But anyway, we'll come back to that. So first of all, to say, who are we actually talking about when we talk about families with children? And there's a couple of things here I just wanted to flag on the way through. So the first one is, unsurprisingly, people tend to have children when they're middle-aged, so that's the chart on the left here. But it's worth noting quite how concentrated that peak is, and that a majority of households in the 25 to 34 and 35 to 44 age categories have some under 16 children in them, but only a narrow majority, and it drops quite sharply either side of that age band. And more precisely, if we look at the age of the children in the household, we can see, unsurprisingly, the older the household, the older the children, but we can see quite how that pattern plays out for different age bands, which I think is quite useful, because when we're thinking of families attending with children, what those behaviours are, as we'll see, vary really quite substantially by the age of the children. Now, one thing it is worth noting in relation to this is that this is based on having any children within that age band in the household. So, for example, I have a 7-year-old and I have an 11-year-old, and therefore I would be included in both the category that said 45 to 54s have a 6 to 10-year-old, and I'm also one of the people that says that that category has an 11 to 15-year-old. And so when we look later at those bands, they're not mutually exclusive. So the same person could be in multiple age bands. So it's worth noting. Turns out what that shows. But that's the overall picture. But the other thing I thought is quite important to notice is when we look at our segments in the audience spectrum, we get used to talking in a little bit of a shorthand about, oh, these are the family segments, these are the other, the non-family segments. And it was just a little caveat to just be a little bit careful about that, because so the chart at the top right is showing the overall picture up to 100%, and you can see that most of it's grey. So most households in all segments aren't families, don't have children in the household. It is higher for the ones we'd expect it to be higher for. So particularly frontline families, trips and treats, they are relatively higher, but they're still not a majority of all people in that segment. So it's just a note to be a little bit careful about that. There's a link there to more information about audience spectrum. But the other thing I would say is a little bit of a caveat on this is that because this is based on survey data, the sample for the smaller segments isn't particularly big. So we shouldn't get too excited about the fact that metroculturals look like they've got a really high proportion. There's probably quite a few families in that group, but it's also just, there's a bit of variation around that data. So treat that with caution, and a couple of the others as listed there. But the main thing is the ones we'd expect to be quite high, trips and treats for families, are high, but they're only a bit higher than the others. It's not a complete kind of night and day kind of contrast. So that's that little caveat over. Now let's look into what the data is saying. So this is what we're seeing for plays and musicals, and exactly aligns with what Orion was saying all that time ago about it tends to drop when you have an under 6. It tends to go up as the child gets older. And what we typically see is once the child gets into the kind of late teens, you start defaulting to or looking like the behavior of people who don't have children in the household at all, because they're not affecting your behavior in the same way. So you do get that kind of classic S shape there. And of course, because she was looking at an aggregate of theatre data in London, there's loads of plays, there's loads of musicals. This is what that data set was showing. Of course, there are some things we know which would be obviously different. So children and family events, obviously, are much higher if you have children in the household. So they massively spike. And I've put the other line in for perspective because we've had to boost the scale. It's gone so high. But essentially, compared to the general population, which would be 100, they're almost 3 times as likely to be engaging in these art forms if there's a 6 to 10-year-old in the household, for example. But it goes up quite sharply, and it drops pretty sharply as well. So there isn't so much of a kind of long tail into the teenage years. A couple of things to note, though. You would expect this to bump people's engagement because, yes, they do children and family things, but it's only 15% of people overall that attend children and family events. It's not enough to skew the overall picture too strongly. And indeed, even among parents, there are other art forms they're more likely to do than children and family events. So they're much more likely to go to films. They're also more likely to go to music festivals. So yes, it has an influence, but it's not predominant. However, we do see when we start looking at how many people have engaged in different art forms, that it varies quite a bit for different types of things. So this was our plays musicals picture, nice little S shape, drops down for up to 5s, it's then higher above that. But for various art forms like films and festivals, there isn't any particular restriction for the under 5s. It's just higher for having children, and it kind of peaks around 6 to 10-year-olds before dropping down again to a kind of more normal picture. But it's generally speaking, it's up across the board. Now, in some cases, it goes up and then drops to lower than it started when you get to the older children. So things like museums and visiting libraries. So people take their kids, but then once they've done that, they're then less likely to go in future, or like when the kids are a bit older, less likely than the general population, which we could speculate about what's driving that, but I think it's kind of interesting that it does drop back that far. Events, dance events, you see a similar kind of picture. It goes up and it ends up dropping down below the level it was to start with. And here's a kind of curious one, which we potentially could come back to in conversation, where we see that for things like art, it's fairly flat, but rises slightly, but then drops down. Classical music, it goes up relatively more sharply. So there's a tendency for people to go to classical music more when they have 6 to 10-year-old children than the general population, but then quite substantially less once they get to late teens. So there's something interesting going on there, I think, and we could maybe unpack that. So, net result of all these different art forms sort of being grouped together, if we just look at that green line, is that on average, regardless of the age of children, overall, having children makes you more likely to do at least one of these wide range of different types of arts and culture. So that list of any is the full list of art forms that we include in the survey. It's all the ones I've mentioned, plus another dozen different types of activity. So it's quite broad, and broadly speaking, having children makes you more likely to go right across the spectrum. It's particularly high for certain art forms for certain times, but it does vary quite a bit between those. So the flip side of that is very few people with children in the household have done none of the arts and heritage activities compared to the general population. So having children sort of, if you like, pushes people out to do more and different cultural activities than they previously would have been doing, which, as we will come on to, potentially creates a sort of moment of opportunity. So hopefully that's all clear so far. I'll just check the chat. I saw there's a couple of comments, so I'm not sure, just checking that's either introductions or, yeah, fine, good. If anyone has anything they want me to clarify, then either do it there or we can pick it up in the conversation. So the question then is, I think, what's going on with the particular people who have children in the household and what might be affecting some of this attendance behaviour? And as ever, with anything involving children, it's complicated. But we've got 2 key charts to show you here about things that change for people and how that relates to the age of their children. So we've asked people, compared to 5 years ago, are you more interested in going, are you less interested in going, or somewhere in between? So we give them sort of 5 options. Where are you on that scale? And we've then subtracted the ones that said the thing that makes them more likely to attend from the ones that, or subtract the ones that make them less likely to attend from the ones that make them more likely to attend, and the net percentage. So are people, relatively speaking, skewed towards attending or away from attending by this factor, if that makes sense? I felt like I garbled that slightly, but you get the idea. The higher it is, the more it's driving them to attend. The lower it is, it's pulling them away from attending, and naught is kind of even. So for various different types of things, are you interested in going? Have you got other things to do, etc.? And what we can see is that there are very substantial differences between those with children in the household and the general population. Particularly, if we see here, so let's just start from the top, that might be easy. So you have children, you have more and different people to go things with, you meet different people, you sort of have, NCT classes, you've got school gates, you've got a whole different circle of people. So more people to attend things with. People, generally speaking, say they're feeling healthier and their interest level goes up. They're kind of motivated more. And again, that's quite an interesting thing about why or how that's happening. So generally speaking, there's a whole load of other things that make you more willing, more able to attend. And that's all those kind of top factors which start off sometimes as a net negative, or just they greatly increase as you could have children, particularly when they're younger, and they start to taper off as the children age. Unsurprisingly, people with young children have less time than they did previously. I'm sure that will resonate for a few people. And gradually, I'm delighted to see it does progressively get better. So you get your life back as the children get older. The flip side of that is people are saying that they So people with children were not reporting that they had less money than they used to. So what's going on here, I think, is that the group without children have more sort of students and younger people and more retirees in, and as a result, those groups have felt a particular financial pinch, so they're more likely to say that they are financially worse off than they previously were. So that's kind of pulling that end of the chart down, and on the older age range, there's also a bit more pressure there as well. But particularly the case that if you've got children, you've got loads of other things to do to compete with the time. It's true of everybody, but it's particularly true with if you've got a sort of preschool child. So that's a kind of range of factors that are going on in people's lives and how that relates to the age of the child. But worth noting that although people with young children and children are saying that they don't necessarily feel worse off financially than they used to, they are more likely to be worried about the cost of living crisis. So there's more of a sense there's kind of financial flux and uncertainty and sort of maybe unknown challenge, even if it's not about the absolute levels of kind of feeling better or worse off. So there's more concern and anxiety there. So we also asked people whether these other factors had increased or decreased in the last 5 years. So to what extent, do you strongly agree? Is it strongly increased or slightly increased? And then we took a weighted average of those to say, so net, is it up or is it down? And unsurprisingly, people with under fives think that their caring responsibilities have gone up a lot in the last 5 years. So that's quite reassuring, because that would otherwise suggest they weren't paying much attention to the small child they had in the room. But apparently it's also correlated with a great sense of well-being, so that's nice, I guess. But less leisure time, and we can see some of these other factors. People are relatively more likely, if you've got young children, to be going to different places and go to a wider range of places. I guess you discover where that soft play is, or go out to different parks or whatever else that you wouldn't otherwise have visited. And you can see that that tapers off as the children get older. So you sort of the range of places you're going to kind of narrows back in again as they get older. So again, we're seeing kind of some quite big shifts in behaviour, range of places people go, but basically the range of people that people meet, all sorts of stuff that's in flux, particularly these younger ranges. And so that will then have a bit of an implication for how you go about engaging on what you might do. But I'm going to pass to Nancy to have a bit of a reflection on that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ollie. That was really interesting. For those of you who missed it earlier, I'm Nancy Sheterline, and I realised I forgot to do an audio described introduction. So for those of you who need it, I am a woman in her 30s with pinky brown hair, and I'm sat in front of a wooden cupboard. So I've been asked to respond to the findings, and yeah, I think I had a few takeaways there. Also lots and lots of questions, which always happens in this case. But, I think firstly, just to point out, the thing that really surprised me was the thing that Ollie pointed out right at the beginning, the audience spectrum breakdown. For those of you using the audience spectrum segmentation, I think it really helps us kind of question that common perception that there are family segments and non-family segments, because there obviously were higher, levels of families within all of those groups we could see across the board, significantly lower for home and heritage, and for supported communities, but they're all the same. And while trips and treats and frontline families, who are the ones we traditionally think of as our kind of family groups, certainly did have higher proportions, I think perhaps maybe a better way to frame it in your heads, this is certainly how I frame it, is I think for those two particular groups, I think the evidence bears out that it's more a case that those groups are influenced by their children. There's a higher degree of influence in terms of the things that they might be engaging with culturally, based on those kind of family interests rather than those kind of personal interests, perhaps. So that was something I thought was kind of worth noting. Then moving on to the kind of analysis we've just seen about art form engagement by children's age. I think, again, to piece together that overall story, that those different charts showing different art forms were telling us about how people engage during their different phases of parenthood. I think we could see there that, you know, parents are attending more museums and libraries when children are younger, and then those engagement levels to kind of one-off event and time-bound activities like seeing a show, like those theatre and musical art forms, tended to increase as the children got older, and were decreased in that first instance. And I think that was similar actually to the film. Again, a kind of like a film is a on at a certain time. It's a kind of time restricted activity. It's not on all day. And similarly, while I think film engagement didn't decrease for those with much younger children, it did increase as those children aged. While those kind of all day offers like festivals or visual arts, I noticed were kind of fairly consistent across different aged, across the parents of different age children, which I thought was really interesting. And I wondered what that told us really about potential barriers and drivers really within those households. You know, has that got anything to do with certain art forms being more accessible to people at different stages of parenthood? And I think there's probably something in there about time. Again, this is asking more questions than I'm answering, perhaps. I'll leave the answering questions to Ollie. But, you know, in my mind, I think parents of younger children in particular require a bit more flexibility on timings, so working around naps, school and nursery pickups and meal times and things. So I, you know, the evidence seems to kind of bear out that in that those kind of things that you can access at a time that suits you during the day tended to be engaged with a little bit more those younger ages. But yeah, just an interesting thing to think about there, really. In terms of how we can actually use this information in our kind of day-to-day roles, I think, firstly, if you might have a good sense already of the kind of age groups of children and those kind of households visiting your organisation already. But if you don't, just to flag, our audience answers surveys do ask that question. So we can provide a really good breakdown if you're interested in doing a bit of survey work. And that survey work is free in Wales and Scotland as well, for anyone from Wales or Scotland joining us today. And then also our population profiles are kind of worth taking a look at. That's kind of going to give you a sense of that kind of the level of households with certain age children in the population. So who you could potentially be reaching and where the opportunity is. And then looking at the findings today, I think it feels like main takeaway we could take from this is thinking about how we can make our events accessible for those for parents with children. And bear in mind as well, we're talking about accessible for those parents to attend with or without their children. You know, certainly speaking as a parent, I think the timings, the kinds of events that I can go to, you know, they need to be after the kids' bedtime so that I can run off and leave them be at home. Things like that. There are some kind of interesting things we could think about there. And I think in particular, the findings from that slide, I think it's slide 15, looking at the kind of the factors at play. Thanks, Ollie. Are particularly actionable in terms of kind of developing our kind of audience plans for this group. You know, we can see that the interest is there, and that's the key thing. So we just need to figure out how to remove barriers and add those incentives, really. You know, we can see that the households with children have this bunch of new people or different people to go out with and do things with. But being busy is the main kind of barrier, really, to engaging there. So I think this information could be really helpful. I think, you know, thinking of removing that busy barrier, I think it's looking at timings of things, looking at lengths, considering less risk taking. I think, you know, if you are going to try and squeeze something in. You kind of want to know that it's going to be something that ticks all the boxes for you. And then obviously, you know, just making your user journeys and the ability to kind of find information about events really nice and easy for people, and getting that information, targeting it at the people who need it. And then in terms of incentives, you know, that's really interesting. That kind of social driver is there, more people to kind of go out with. So I think it's a case of kind of working with that. You can kind of plan kind of offers around that. You know, whether that's a bring a friend offer, whether that's a you know, share a bottle of wine before the show offer, whatever it is. I think there are ways that you can kind of use that to your advantage there. I think really my final point is that crucially what we've seen is there is a real opportunity here. I think not only, I know our kind of previous findings from some of our longitudinal analysis has shown that those family groups, the frontline families and trips and treats, are some of the only groups who are engaging more now than they did pre-COVID. So opportunity, but also, you know, that finding that people with kids are far less likely than the rest of the population to not have engaged in any arts or heritage activities. You know, that says to me there's an entry point there. There's a discovery period that people are going through, during which habits might be set, if the offer is right from your venue or organisation. And as I think Ollie touched on, I think, you know, people's tastes become plastic for a while during this period, and they are experiencing a greater range of places. They're visiting different places and types of places, and different, and going to things with different types of people. So I think it's taking advantage of that, and making sure that the offer is there for those people, to make sure that your venue is the place that they are going to, really. And not only that, I think it's obviously, you know, having children is a life stage that happens across the board. So it's an opportunity here to engage a much greater diversity of people. You know, these people that we're talking about that are included in these figures aren't just your traditional kind of arts engagers. You've got a much the breadth of people within that data. So I think it's something to kind of pay heed to and make the most of if you can. No, I think that's probably all I've got to say.
Well, thank you very much.